Back in 2006, when Major League Baseball pitcher Curt Schilling announced that he'd be opening up a video game studio, many people, including myself, were pretty surprised. 38 Studios, as it would come to be known, has yet to show their upcoming MMO, codenamed Copernicus, but they have collaborated with big huge games for the fantasy RPG Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning. Reckoning takes place in the Feylands, which is just one region within the greater world of Amalur. The Feylands are home to the Fey, an immortal race which is divided into two distinct factions, the Court of Winter and the Court of Summer. 10 years before the start of the game, a splinter faction within the Winter Court, known as the Tuatha, rose to power and began a genocidal war against all the mortal races. The game begins with your character waking up on a pile of dead bodies, after having just been brought back to life in a resurrection research facility called the Well of Souls. You are the first mortal ever to be resurrected, and as such, you become fateless. Amalur is a world that is strictly governed by fate. It is just accepted fact that everyone has a fate and they can't change it. And there are even some individuals, called Fate Weavers, that can read a person's fate, basically telling their future. Because you have no fate, everything you do alters the established design. The fate of any individuals you come into contact with will change, meaning you can save people that are supposed to die, kill people that are supposed to live, and most importantly, change the outcome of huge, world-changing events. I really like this premise, and I think it really makes the story stand out from the typical fantasy plot. Even though this is basically just another save-the-world fantasy game, it is really well written and well told, and the fate aspect is actually pretty unique. The Tuatha will succeed in their war against mortals. Fate has deemed it so. But because your character exists outside the threads of fate, you are the only one with a chance to stop the war. The cool thing about the basic idea of the main character being fateless is that it ties into everything you do as a player. To contrast, take Skyrim. Your character is the Dragonborn, but that really only matters in the main quest. In Reckoning, nearly every quest is affected by your fatelessness. You are basically an agent of change wherever you go, and the game does a great job of using this in most of the plot lines, from the main quest down to the insignificant side quests. If there's one thing about Reckoning that pretty much everyone will notice, is that it shares a lot of things in common with the Elder Scrolls series, and by extension, Skyrim. Now, this is certainly understandable given Ken Ralston's history with the Elder Scrolls series, but even so, the similarities to Elder Scrolls are mostly superficial, and you would never confuse Reckoning for an Elder Scrolls game. One major aspect of Reckoning that differentiates it from Skyrim is the way the world is structured. While Reckoning is technically an open-world game, it's quite different from the pick-a-direction and walk nature of something like Skyrim. The best way to describe the world of Reckoning would be that it is a linear open-world game. The Feylands are divided into 5 regions, which each have their own look and design, and each of these regions is divided into anywhere from 5 to 10 individual areas, and these are connected to each other by narrow paths. You can go anywhere you want and fast travel to discover locations like you'd expect, but you're basically moving through the world as the game progresses, as opposed to just exploring like a traditional open world game. You start the game on the westernmost area of the world map, and you finish it on the easternmost.
Thank the gods, somebody finally came. Tell us, are you from Gorehart or Dyden Hill?
The main quest is the major catalyst for moving forward to new areas, and as soon as you do enter a new city or town, you will be bombarded with tons of new quests. In fact, I'd have to say there are probably too many quests in this game. For the first 20 hours or so that I played, I was doing pretty much every side quest I came across, and unfortunately, this was resulting in me doing a lot of meaningless and repetitive tasks. It was at this point that I decided to do only the side quests that seemed interesting and mostly just stick to the faction quest lines and the main quest. By the end of the game, I had clocked in over 57 hours of playtime with around 120 total quests complete. Of these quests, about half consisted of side quests, and the other half were the faction and main quests.
The first phase of the trial is...
As a rule, you can expect the faction and main story quests to be much more interesting and just overall better designed than the side content. Dungeons for these are also much better than the side dungeons, which can sometimes feel very similar to each other and just overall very generic.
Another cave. How interesting. Ah, a waterfall. That's lovely.
I would recommend that you stick to the factions and the main story content and only do the side quests that seem interesting. And there are still a good deal that are interesting, but there are definitely a lot of fetch quests and menial tasks. There's probably around 100 hours of content in the game. As a reference, I had over 60 unfinished side quests in my quest log when I finished, but I would have been burned out long before I reached the 100-hour mark had I attempted to do everything. Reckoning is of course a role-playing game, which means it has character progression. Like Skyrim, Reckoning puts a large focus on allowing the player to make any type of character they want. I would say it definitely achieves this goal. When you level up, you're allotted 3 points to put into various skills and abilities. These abilities fall into 3 categories: sorcery, might, and finesse, and these do what you'd think they do. So if you mostly unlock sorcery abilities, you will just naturally become a magic user. The game doesn't force you to pick a class from the start. Instead, it allows you to select classes as you go based on how you build your character. There are 6 tiers of classes split into any possible combination of abilities you could choose from, with each tier requiring more points in each tree to unlock. Each tier of a specific discipline will add additional bonuses to your character. In addition to going for one specific discipline, you can also mix and match abilities from the various skill trees and still find a class that fits your character. The leveling is definitely well done, and really makes you feel in control of the way your character progresses. You can even start over and redistribute all your points at any time in the game for just a few thousand gold, which is a great way to try out all the different combinations you could possibly make.
Mortal? Is this Wenson's idea of humor? Well...
The dialogue system in Reckoning is a bit weird, and kind of disappointing to be honest. The game uses both a Bioware-style dialogue wheel and a more traditional list of topics. When you're making a dialogue choice, you get the wheel, and when you're investigating various topics, you get the list. Unfortunately, the dialogue is just not up to the standards you would hope for, especially given the high quality of writing and other aspects of the game. When you are discussing various topics, you simply get one-word selections, and then the characters tell you about the topic. There is absolutely no illusion that you are actually having a conversation with these characters. It'd just be like walking up to someone on the street and saying, "New York," and they start telling you everything they know about New York. Just doesn't feel like any real-world situation. Even when you get the wheel, they don't write out full sentences. In something like Mass Effect, it makes sense that they only put the basic ideas in the wheel because you hear Shepard voice the complete thought. In Reckoning, the game just expects you to fill in the blanks in your head. It would have been nice if your character was voiced, but RPGs have been doing much better than this without voice characters for years, and it's really disappointing to have so little control over your character as a person in this game. A role-playing game should make you feel like you're creating a persona for this blank slate of a character, but at no point in Reckoning did I ever feel like that. On a more positive note, the loot in Reckoning is actually pretty well done. The game utilizes color-coded loot like you'd find in an MMO, with blues, greens, purples, etc. Like an Elder Scrolls game, the loot and weapons are divided into tiers based on the material they're made from, such as iron, steel, and so on. But there are far more unique items here than you'd find in something like Skyrim. The game also has extensive crafting systems that include alchemy, blacksmithing, and sage crafting, which is creating gems to use for enchanting. The crafting adds an extra layer to the equipment that is definitely welcome, but unfortunately it can undermine the loot late in the game. Minor problem that arises when you collect as much loot as you do in this game is trying to manage it all. The menus, and in particular the inventory, can get more than a little cumbersome. The way the inventory is laid out requires way too much scrolling, and even just equipping your character can get tedious. Luckily, the game does mostly get around this by having a junk category. You can send any item you plan on selling directly to your junk, even while you're in the process of looting. And there's a very handy Sell All Junk button when you're at a merchant. The inventory definitely has the capability to get a little unwieldy, But if you use the junk function correctly, you should be fine. Leading up to release, the most touted aspect of the game by both media and the design team themselves was the combat. And after playing the game for nearly 60 hours, I have to say that it is by far the best aspect of the game. The gameplay is pretty much like God of War or any other similar third-person action game, but with slightly less depth. The closest comparison might actually be the recent Fable games, but I think Reckoning edges those games out in the combat department. You can equip 2 weapons at a time, with the X button on the 360 controller being one, and the Y button being the other. As you level up your proficiency with certain types of weapons, you unlock new moves. These are never complex multi-button combos like you'd find in something like God of War, but quick moves that are easy to pull off, such as attacking out of a roll, attacking while blocking, and other similar moves. And usually, these start a 3 or 4 hit combo that finishes off with a critical hit. The combat just feels great, and it really seems to have weight, and overall is just very satisfying. In addition to standard combat, you also have spells and abilities, and these mix up the combat nicely and can get pretty awesome late in the game. Obviously, magic users will depend more on spells than other classes, but there are some might and finesse abilities as well. Spells and abilities are used by holding down the right trigger and then mapping the abilities to the face buttons. This means you can only have 4 abilities mapped at a time, but this is really never much of an issue because as you unlock more high-level abilities, the other ones become useless anyway. As awesome as the gameplay is, I have 2 problems with it. Though they're both minor, they do hold the game back a little bit. The first is the camera. When I first started playing, I thought the camera was the worst thing ever. It needs constant attention and cannot be left alone at all. This means you're going to always have your thumb on the right stick whenever you're traveling around the world, and in combat, it sometimes fails to zoom out far enough, and it never reorients itself based on the position of enemies. This seemed like a huge issue at first, like I said, but I eventually did get used to it. If you get in the habit of manually recentering the camera behind your character by clicking the right stick, whenever you can't see the enemies, the camera won't cause too many issues. The other issue I had with gameplay was the difficulty. The game is simply too easy. In my nearly 60 hours with the game on the normal setting, I only died 3 times. This is in part because the challenge is just simply not there, but also because you have a safety net. Reckoning mode, which is similar to the Rage modes from the God of War series, basically gives you a short time to kill any enemies, even bosses in some instances, without the threat of death. You have to build up to being able to use this mode by gaining fate energy, but you seemingly always have enough. I would recommend anyone looking for a decent challenge to play on the hard setting. Reckoning doesn't go for realistic visuals, instead opting for a more stylized look. I imagine some people won't like the style, but I think it works great. I certainly appreciate games that look like reality, but oftentimes, I find games with a great art style have fewer rough edges than those that try for photorealism. The environments look nice, and each of the regions has a very distinct look. Combat animations are great as well, and some of the spells look really cool. Some people may not like the lack of freedom in this game when compared to Skyrim, but if there is one area where the smaller scope gives a huge advantage, it is definitely performance instability. I didn't encounter a single glitch throughout the whole game, and the game never once crashed on me. Frame rate was almost constantly steady, only dropping occasionally when there were lots of enemies on screen, combined with some of the more elaborate spell effects. On the audio side, Reckoning is mostly good as well. The voice acting is really well done, and every character has unique dialogue. Like any big RPG, you will hear repeat voice actors, but never once do different characters say the same thing. And there are never any instances of different voice actors saying the same lines. The music is mostly typical fantasy fare, but there are a few standout tracks. sound effects for combat are very impactful and contribute to the feeling of weight present in the combat. Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning is not quite the definitive action RPG some were hoping for, but it is still an excellent game, and the first entry in what will hopefully wind up being one of the next great fantasy series. The close release to the juggernaut that is Skyrim may end up hurting Reckoning a bit, but it is definitely worthy of success. If you thought the combat in Skyrim was lackluster, but are turned off by the thin RPG elements and immature humor of Fable, Reckoning is absolutely the game for you. My final score for Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning is an 8.8 out of 10. Head on over to GamingIrresponsibly.com for the full written review, as well as other reviews, news, and previews.